breathing room for the courts to work and for you to not be in violation of a direct order as long as possible, with the understanding that eventually you'll run out of room potentially, and that you may face a separation or a board of inquiry or separation board. We'll talk about how to handle those. So hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully we get results soon. But as it is with the Coast Guard, we've seen an all coast showing that they're ramping up the pressure, which is without pressure, there cannot be power if we're talking internal combustion engines. And with other things, same thing with this. When the situation gets egregious and the government can't wiggle out of by claiming that there really isn't any egregious action going on, it makes it more clear for the judge, whichever judge that may be, and provides more of an impetus to intervene. So pressure is good in that sense. So you want to make sure that you have a religious accommodation request submitted. We talked with some folks last week and a few weeks ago that had not submitted one. Even if your contacts say it's untimely, submit one in writing anyways. The class certifications thus far for Navy and for Air Force cover people who have submitted religious accommodation requests. And in the case of at least the Air Force, covers folks who have met with chaplains, certified that they think that they hold sincere religious beliefs. So submit your religious accommodation package if you have not yet. And the fact is that there are no expiration dates for constitutional rights. There is some room for the government or for an employer to set a deadline for accomplishing a certain thing, but in this case, we take the position that there's no deadline for a constitutional right, and to assert that constitutional right under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and applicable military regulations. You don't want to be fighting about deadlines, though. So if you're facing an upcoming deadline, maintain situational awareness of that. And for those who submitted religious accommodation requests early on, that so much the better. There's no question that it was submitted timely. So submit your religious accommodation request. It's going to come back with an initial denial and typically a 5-day order, get the shot within 5 days, or file for a voluntary separation or potentially some other courses of action. So those who know that they are ineligible for a voluntary separation, if you receive one of these courses of action to file for a voluntary separation, it's low threat to make that request as a means of buying time. With that said, if you might qualify for a voluntary separation, you might get separated. So you need to make sure that A, you're at peace with the idea of being separated, and B, that you put in enough buzzwords and keywords to show that this voluntary aspect is simply not voluntary. It is completely coerced. It's not what you want. You have no other options, etc. So phrase it something like, I have requested a religious accommodation from the COVID shot mandate. I face being separated with a loss of these different things and a negative discharge. One of the courses of action was I could request to voluntarily separate. I do not wish to voluntarily separate, but seeing no other choice or little likelihood of success and keeping my honor intact and having my characterization of service be accurate, I feel that I must make this even though I don't want to. Something along those lines. So you can request that voluntary separation. A number of folks who have done that subsequently had the voluntary separation request denied based on the needs of the service. And then it comes back to you with, some months later having bought some time. Alternatively, you can make a request for a Privacy Act request for your religious accommodation packet, and to make that request for two reasons. One, to buy additional time. You make the request to the applicable FOIA officer, and then you submit that request to your chain of command who gave you the notice of the denial, and you make that, you submit that to them, asking them for additional time in which to respond for your appeal to be submitted. And that way, you effectively state that you've submitted the Privacy Act request. It's difficult for you to appeal a decision that you don't have the underlying information, so you've submitted that. you're asking for a 30-day extension or an extension for the duration of the time it takes for the Privacy Act request to come back fulfilled. Your command, in many instances, will approve that. Some will do it on a 30-day basis. We have to come back and ask for more time. Others will give you approval for the duration, or we've seen some commands deny an extension request. So you need to make sure that you submit an appeal within the timeline that you've originally been given to keep that appeal alive. And again, it doesn't have to be grandiose. We have samples. Others have samples out there. You can email military@lc.org for a very good sample. Use that as an outline, and you can certainly cite the sources that it cites, but put it in your own words and don't sweat it. It just needs to check the boxes and be sufficient. And so don't worry about it. Make sure you get it on a time. Alternatively, if it comes back and your Privacy Act request, you get an extension, your Privacy Act request comes back unredacted, you can see if your immediate command recommended approval or denial. And if they recommended approval, then those recommendations may directly contradict what the MAGCOM has come back with and said are reasons for denial. So you can use those in support of your appeal. Alternatively, if they come back and they say, if they're just parroting talking points, you can rebut those and explain how that's mistaken and the real truth is this. And so eventually that will come back with a final denial. And at that point, you can, and some of these have varied in terms of when separation requests, voluntary separation options have been given. You may get that at that later time. But most people will be facing being in violation of the final denial, after which consequences are going to start to happen. So you can attempt to stave off those consequences and remain in a good standing status. You can submit you can, as soon as your final denial comes back, call Base Medical or another medical provider, get an appointment to come in and talk to the doctor about the COVID shot. And then you notify your command that you've scheduled that appointment, but unfortunately it's about 3 weeks out. And so in the meantime, you're asking for temporary administrative exemption. You're submitting a written medical exemption request, medical accommodation request, at which point, and you'll be discussing this with the doctor to see if you qualify. And in the meantime, you are under suspense of that directive, and you are not in violation because you've submitted the medical accommodation request. You go to the doctor says, sorry, I can't do this. I have to be a rubber stamp from the service's direction. Denied. Then you appeal that in writing at the latest time that you can appeal it. So don't appeal it right then and there. Even if it says it's the same person, you submit it in writing at the end of that appeal period and buy yourself, 1 to 5 days worth of time before you may be in violation. You could then submit a request for reconsideration based on changed circumstances. And for those in the Air Force, you have DFI 52201 and some support there. For those who are not in the Air Force, you can cite just the changed circumstances going on that we see out there. We've got the European Command exception to policy request approving 16 unvaccinated soldiers to deploy to European Command. We've got the SpaceCom email. The general says that both vaccine-induced and natural immunity are contributing to more positive outcomes. And those support not wearing masks. Well, if it supports not wearing masks, and if natural immunity is a thing, then it should also extend to other things because, remember, masks were a mitigation measure. And so if we don't even have to take mitigation measures based on natural immunity, we shouldn't have to get the shot based on natural immunity. We've also got citations to recent studies that have shown long-lasting natural immunity. Now we have knowledge. Previously we did not. The Air Force did not consider this new knowledge of a year-long study showing long-lasting natural immunity. And the fact that you're still doing your job and there have been no COVID outbreaks traced back to you. So eventually you're going to be in violation of an order and you're going to run out of time. They may accept that, they may not. And they're going to, for those who do not rate a separation board, they're going to administratively separate you. You have the option of of going to the Board of Correction of Military Records and requesting an upgrade of your discharge paperwork on your DD-214, your reenlistment code, and from a general to an honorable discharge. But that takes time. You can't do it for at least 6 months until after your discharge, and you have to do it within 3 years of your discharge. And so my recommendation is not to do that until we see significant movement in the courts at the Court of Appeals or U.S. Supreme Court level. So those are that's where, if you are do not rate a separation board, that's where it's going to go, and it's going to be a longer term solution. For those who do rate a separation board, then and some of those who might not rate a separation board include reserve component members, where they can simply be given a letter of reprimand or two, and then given an opportunity to rebut those. And any opportunity to file a rebuttal you should take, because that delays the process. To file it on the very last day that it's due, and then they have to consider that. And so, but if you do that, and the letter of reprimand is upheld, and then you will be notified if you're reserve that you've been involuntarily transferred to the individual ready reserve. And so no pay, no point status, probably a better status than full discharge, and probably at this time easier to replace you depending or to place you back into an active status based on court orders. And then there are those who rate a separation board and can't be immediately transferred to IRR, and those will be scheduled, and those will be out for a ways, and I think we will have court action before those reach a final adjudication. So that's an overview of the process. Make sure to get your religious accommodation request in. Make sure to comply as much as possible with all applicable deadlines, including the appeal, but try to stretch those appeals out based on reasonable requests. It's reasonable to ask for my religious accommodation request packet so I can see the reasoning of the command and their recommendations. And just know, though, that most of the Privacy Act requests coming back are heavily redacted right now, but not all of them. And those redactions are going to black out the most helpful material. Certainly raises questions about the process and the fairness of the process. If the exception that they're relying upon is potential litigation, why is the DOD doing such things and saying such things in religious accommodation request packets that they know that service members are probably going to want to sue them for? Doesn't give us much confidence in that process. But nonetheless, it's something to ask for, and it gives you the possibility of extending your timeline. And with that, I guess let's go ahead, Cindy, and